Welcome. I'm Ellen Smith, a member of the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto. We welcome you to this educational presentation on the pros and cons of the measures that appear on your ballot for the November 3rd election. The League was formed in 1920 after women gained the right to vote. So this year we are celebrating both our 100th anniversary and that of the passage of the 19th Amendment. The League does not support or oppose political parties or candidates for office, but it does work to empower voters. Our organization has two distinct roles. One is advocacy for public policy positions that we have studied and support. The other is voter service, bringing voters impartial information about candidates and issues. This is the hat we are wearing today, namely to educate you on the issues before you cast your vote. Our speakers have studied the text of the measures and reviewed content about them in newspapers, websites, and other sources, as well as having discussions with other League members across the state. They're prepared to give you the facts about the measures and the opinions of supporters and opponents without prejudice. Let me tell you how we will proceed. First, our speakers will provide you with some useful election information and an overview of the presentation. Then each ballot measure will be discussed, its background, what it would do if passed, and the arguments from both sides in favor of and against. If you have questions, please utilize the Q&A function and type in your question. The chat function is not activated. After each measure, I will ask the presenter to ask as many of your questions as time permits before we move on to the next measure. If all goes as anticipated, plan on about an hour to review the 12 state and 3 local measures. So let's get started. Our speakers today are Heidi Schwenk and Judy Pickering.
Good morning. My name is Heidi. First off is how to vote Santa Clara County. Next slide, please. Election day is November 3rd. Voting centers will open at 7 a.m. and close promptly at 8 p.m. Ballots were mailed October 5th. They may take 5 to 7 days to receive. There are many ballot drop boxes in Palo Alto. They can be found at the Palo Alto City Hall, outside the city clerk's office, Palo Alto High School, Rinconada Branch Library, and Mitchell Park Library. And I must say, I have heard that some mailboxes, drop boxes, are not consistent with the real ones. So just be sure that when you look at it, that there is a label on it that definitely says that it's from the Santa Clara County Registrar's Office. Others can be found on a website at sccgov.org or in your county voter information guide. There will be 24-hour official ballot drop boxes from October 5th until November 3rd. The ballots will be collected from the drop boxes by the Registrar of Voters starting October 7th through October 16th on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, then collected daily from October 19th to November 3rd until 8 p.m. If you have any questions about voting, one of the fastest ways to get answers is by using the sccgov.org website or by calling the Santa Clara County Registrar's Office. Be sure to sign your ballot and use the postage-paid envelope if you are going to mail it in. Safe in-person voting is optional at any of the many voting centers starting October 31st to November 3rd. If you would like voting assistance, contact a voting center or the Registrar of Voters as soon as possible. If you choose to mail your ballot on November 3rd, check when your post office closes. Most close at 5 p.m. Registration. The last day for registration with the Registrar's Office is October 19th, but you can still register and vote at any voting center from October 31st and as late as November 3rd. Conditionally means that your ID information will need to be verified before your ballot is counted if you register and vote on the same day. Tracking your ballot is something new. You can register online at Where's My Ballot for this service. You can sign up for an email confirmation and/or text confirmation. You will receive a confirmation that you've signed up, and you will receive additional confirmations to follow your ballot until it has been processed completely. Next slide, please. We're giving an overview of our presentation. You know there are 12 state propositions and 3 local measures. We will not be viewing the propositions in numerical order. We have organized the propositions into categories to hopefully make it easier to understand the nuances of similar ones. For instance, under the first category of civil rights, we will review Prop 16, 17, and 18. The second category has the only bond measure on the ballot. There are 2 propositions under property tax, 2 under criminal justice, and 4 under state regulations. Near the end of the presentation, we will review the 3 measures, 1 for Palo Alto residents only and 2 for Santa Clara County residents. The voting rules are: all state propositions to win is a 50% plus 1 majority count. An initiative statute is a direct initiative and a measure that's put on the state for either a constitutional amendment or other, and it can be rejected or passed by voters. The voting rules for the 3 measures to win is a 2/3 majority count. Next slide, please. Civil rights proposition. This slide shows Proposition 16, which is about whether or not to legalize affirmative action in the state of California. The way it is now in 1996, Prop 209 was voted in to prohibit affirmative action when making decisions about who to hire from a particular category for public contracts, government employment, as well as who will be admitted to California public universities and colleges. This proposition will repeal Prop 209 and allow diversity as a factor so long as the institution is consistent with federal and state laws related to equal protection. This is not a preference initiative, it is a diversity initiative. The prop is to encourage the hiring and acceptance of people from different categories and to continue admitting qualified students along with hiring the best person or contractor. This is not a quota system. This prop would not force anyone to use it. The fiscal impacts, if it passes, will have no direct effect on the California state or local budgets because the measure does not require any change to current policies or programs. All costs would depend on choices made by the state, each county, city, and university college program. Next slide, please. Supporters say affirmative action will help women and people of color who have faced inequalities as a result of who they are. This California constitutional amendment will give them equal opportunities and the quality education they deserve. Minorities are not sharing in our state's prosperity, even though they are one of the largest populations in the state. At this time, there is 141 million in contributions as of September 29th. How it got here, this prop was placed on the ballot by the state legislature. Opponents say that California state, its counties, cities, and public universities and colleges should treat everyone equally. 1 million has been collected in contributions. A yes vote means that you approve of the change this proposition would make. A no vote means that you want to leave things the way they are. This is a California constitutional amendment. Majority vote of 50% plus 1 is needed to pass. Are there any questions?
I see no questions at this time.
Great. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is Proposition 17, the voting rights for people on parole. This would restore voting rights to people released from prison who are supervised on parole. The way it is now, people in state prison or on parole cannot vote or run for office. However, people who are serving time in county jail or on county supervised probation retain their right to vote. California is one of only 3 states that prevent individuals on parole from voting. Proposition 17 would restore the right to register and vote to those citizens who have been released from prison and who are on parole. It would also give those on parole the right to run for an elected office if they are eligible. The Fiscal impact. This would increase county annual voter registration costs and a one-time state cost to update voter registration cards. And it's in tens of thousands of dollars. Next slide. So supporters say that voting rights should not be restricted without compelling reason. Restoration of voting rights encourages re-entry into the community and reduces recidivism. Also, parolees live and pay taxes in the community, so they should have a say in their government. So far, there have been just $850,000, and it was placed on the ballot by the state legislature. Opponents say sentencing for a serious crime includes both the time in prison and the time on parole. These offenders should complete their sentence prior to the restoration of their voting rights. Also, parole is an adjustment period when offenders prove their desire to change. And there's been no contributions. This is a constitutional amendment. It just is a simple majority. So a yes vote means people on state parole who are US citizens, residents of California, and at least 18 years old would be able to vote. A no vote means people on state parole would continue to be unable to vote in California. Are there any questions?
No questions at this time.
Okay, so let's go on to Proposition 18, which has to do with the primary voting for 17-year-olds. This would amend the California Constitution to allow 17-year-olds to vote in primary elections and special elections. So the way it is now, a statewide general election is held every 2 years. Citizens who are eligible to vote in the election if they reside in California and are 18 years old by the date of the general election. Proposition 18 would allow 17-year-olds who would be 18 by the general election to vote in the primary and any special elections. There's an 8-month gap between the primary and the election time. This would also allow 17-year-olds to run for elected office if they are eligible. The fiscal impacts, again, there would be an increased annual voter registration costs and a one-time cost to update voter registration costs in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Next slide. Supporters say Proposition 18 allows young voters the opportunity to participate in the full election cycle. They would be able to vote during the primary to choose what will be on the general election ballot. This would also encourage establishing good voting habits. Opponents say that 17-year-olds are not legally adults and are not mature enough to make important decisions. They would be subject to undue influences by both parents and teachers. This was placed on the ballot by the state legislature. Supporters have collected about $400,000 as of the end of September. The opponents, there are no contributions. And again, this is a constitutional amendment and it's a simple majority. Do we have any questions?
No questions, no.
Okay, now we go into bonds propositions.
This slide shows Proposition 14, Stem Cell Research Institute Bond. The way it is now, California Prop 71 was passed in 2004 to fund stem cell research in California after the federal government decided not to fund any nationwide. A $3 billion bond was approved to cover expenses for research, medical studies, facilities, interns, and a governing board called CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. CIRM runs every aspect of dispensing grants to universities and colleges. As of June 2020, there was only $30 million in reserve from the original 2004 bond measure. This proposition would allow the state to sell $5.5 billion in bonds to continue CIRM's funding of stem cell and other medical research and training, such as stem cell therapy, the delivery of treatments to cancer, heart disease, diabetes, kidney disease patients, build research facilities, and pay for administrative expenses. $1.5 billion would be restricted to further study the brain and central nervous system, including diseases such as Alzheimer, Parkinson, epilepsy, among others. The changes are also intended to expand access to more stem cell treatment. Fiscal impacts. The state would need to repay $260 million a year for 30 years, which is less than 1% of the general fund, and be the source of payments. After 30 years, the total paid could possibly potentially be 7.8 billion. The state is also entitled to a 3% royalty of revenue for the new inventions that result from research or new medical treatments funded by CIRM, and that would go into the general fund. The amount the state might receive is not clear. Next slide, please. Supporters say California funding has led to significant advances in treatments and cures for many diseases, including over 2,900 medical discoveries to help patients with cancer, diabetes, HIV/AIDS, and children with immune system deficiency, among others. Prop 14 will contribute to the rebound of California economy by employing students as interns, scientists and doctors as leaders, and even construction workers to build new facilities. Prop 14 is supported by over 70 patient advocate organizations. It will increase patient access and affordable treatments and provide patients and their families and caregivers with financial assistance. The bond is for true basic research. It takes a long time to develop treatments. How did it get here? This petition, funded by Robert Klein, who chairs CIRM and led Prop 71 in 2004. It was put on the ballot by petition signatures. Opponents say previous funding has not yet yielded the promised results for treatments or economic benefits. At this time, there are zero contributions that we know of. A yes vote authorizes bond funds to continue stem cell research in California with CIRM. A no vote would stop the funding for CIRM stem cell research. This is an initiative statute bond measure. 50% plus 1 is needed for approval. Are there any questions?
No question.
Next slide, please.
Now we're going to talk about property taxes. Propositions. There are two propositions that concern property taxes. The first one is Proposition 15, which is a tax on commercial and industrial properties, which I'll just call commercial from now on. This would increase funding sources for public schools and local government by changing the tax assessment of commercial properties only. So the way it is now, just a little history. So property taxes fund schools and local governments. In 1978, the California citizens voted in Proposition 13, which has held the assessed value of properties, which is set as the sales price of the property. There's a maximum increase of 2% per year increase, unless the property is sold, which resets the assessed value to the sales price. The market value of property actually increases closer to 9% annually. The tax rate is approximately 1% of the assessed value for all property. This is true for all property, residential, commercial, and agriculture. So Proposition 15 would change the way assessed value is determined for commercial properties only. This is also called a split roll proposition because what it would do is split the tax roll between commercial and industrial property and residential and agricultural properties. So starting in 2022 and phased in through 2025, commercial properties would be taxed on the current market value. And this would be reassessed approximately every 3 years. It exempts small businesses with property holdings worth $3 million or less and commercial agriculture. It also reduces taxes on business equipment by $500,000, which would start in 2024. The fiscal impacts, most commercial landowners will pay more property taxes. The revenue increase of about $6.5 to $11.5 billion per year would go to funding schools and governments. This would be split between 60% of the funds would go to local government and 40% would go to school, and this is based on per capita. Okay, next slide. So supporters say Proposition 13 was enacted to help homeowners, but wealthy corporations have used loopholes to avoid paying taxes. The residential share has risen from 55% to 72%, while the commercial share of property taxes has fallen. With Proposition 15, the top 10% of commercial property owners will pay 92% of the new taxes, and the schools and local government need the funding. It got here on a petition by the California Teachers Association and the California Federation of Teachers. the SEIU, and the Chan Zuckerberg and the San Francisco Foundation. So opponents say that this would be the largest property tax increase in California history. It significantly increases the cost of doing business in California and would cause job losses. It can also increase the cost of living. The supporters have raised 36 million in contributions. The opponents have raised 22 million in contributions. This is a constitutional amendment, and it is a simple majority to pass. So a yes vote means property taxes on most commercial properties worth more than $3 million would go up to provide new funding for local governments and schools. A no vote means property taxes on commercial properties would stay the same. Local governments and schools would not get new funding. Are there any questions?
Yes, we have two questions. First one is, does agricultural property include things like tools, equipment, etc., as well as land?
That I found it looking back through the information that was a little unclear, but it does give a $500,000 tax break on business equipment, which I would assume would include farm equipment as well, because that's business equipment. But that I would go to the Voter's Edge and look on that. That's more than I know. Sorry.
And the other question is, how would, if their opponents say this would cost a lot of jobs, do you know any more about that argument, how it would cost a lot of jobs?
No, it's just that the idea is that it would cost, the cost of doing business in California would increase, and that the thought is that people would move out of California and not have their businesses here, and that would cause a job loss.
Thank you. That's it. So we can move on to the next proposition.
Okay, so this is also about property tax. This has to do with property tax transfers. The transfer of assessed value from one property to a new property. Now the way this is, so there's no change in assessed value. So the way it is now is, since 1978 with Proposition 13, property value for taxation, or the assessed valuation, is based on the sales price. Property is only reassessed when ownership changes. However, special rules apply to homeowners who are over 55, severely disabled, or victims of a wildfire or a flood. They are allowed a one-time only transfer of the lower valuation to a new property, as long as it's in the same county, and there's about 10 other counties that allow it as well. And the property has to be at the same or lesser value. Okay, so what would Proposition 19 do? Proposition 19 expands the special rules for those eligible homeowners, people who are over 55 and severely disabled. It allows for 3 transfers of assessed valuation, and you can move anywhere in the state and for any value home. This also has to do with inherited properties. It would change properties that are inherited from parents or grandparents must be owner occupied or a farm to avoid reassessment. Any new funding from this proposition, 75% of the new funding would go to fire protection. So the fiscal impacts is increased. There's expected increased revenue in the tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars from the narrowed rules for inherited properties. There would also be a reduction in revenue from the expanded rule for eligible homeowners, because their property taxes would stay low. And then also there's an expected increase in taxes and fees from the sale of homes, and that increase in funding is what would go into fire protection. Next slide. Supporters say this gives tax savings to seniors and the disabled. It closes the loophole for inherited rental properties while protecting family homes and farms. And it increases funding for fire protection. Let's see, and the opponents say that this is a big increase on inherited property disguised as tax reform and erodes the protections of Proposition 13. Voters have overwhelmingly supported the right of families to pass property to their heirs without undue financial burden. This bill got placed on the ballot by the state legislature after negotiating with realtor organizations. Supporters have raised almost 37 million in contributions. Opponents have raised just $45,000 in contributions. And it's a constitutional amendment. It requires a simple majority to pass. So a yes vote is all eligible homeowners would be able to transfer lower taxes when they move. Only inherited properties used as primary homes or farms would be eligible for those tax savings. A no vote means some eligible homeowners would continue to be eligible for tax savings when they move, and all inherited properties would continue to be eligible for property tax savings. Do we have any questions?
No questions.
Okay, so let's go on. Now we'll go into criminal justice.
This slide shows Prop 20, sentencing, parole, and DNA collection. The way it is now, I'd like to give you some history about parole. In 2014, Prop 47 converted some theft crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. People charged with a felony have longer jail time. Another change for parole was in 2016 with Prop 57. It allows nonviolent prisoners to become parole eligible after serving their primary term. At this time, DNA samplings are collected from felons who are sex offenders, arsonists, and then stored in the Department of Justice database. This prop would reclassify 47 misdemeanors to either felonies or violent felonies, such as repeat shoplifting, domestic violence, and sexual violence. It would restrict parole for certain offenses currently considered to be nonviolent. Prisoners would have to wait an extra year to be evaluated for parole once they were turned down. Currently, they wait 1 year. Prop 20 would make them wait 2 years. Additional DNA sampling would be taken from adults convicted of certain misdemeanors, such as the repeat shoplifting, forging checks, and certain domestic violence crimes. The fiscal impacts. Precise costs are difficult to estimate because it could result in an increase in the prison population and change the way parole supervision is handled. Prop 20 would increase state and local county costs for the courts, correctional facilities, and law enforcement officers. Next slide, please. Supporters say Prop 20 would not increase the prison population. It would only ensure that people convicted of these crimes serve their full sentences. Prop 20 reclassifies certain misdemeanor crimes, like assault with a deadly weapon, sex crimes, and child abuse, as violent felonies. At this time, there's $4.3 million in contributions. How did it get here? The proposition was petitioned and funded by the police unions and supermarkets. Opponents say that the initiative would perpetuate unjust policies that disproportionately harm poor people and people of color. They also say this is a backward step. The right reform is to promote mental health treatment and rehabilitation programs. $5.8 million has been collected in contributions. The opponents are California Direct Crime Supervisors for Safety and Justice, retired police chief, City of San Diego, and former director of finance of State of California. A yes vote means that you approve of the changes this proposition would make. A no vote means that you want to leave things as they are now. In addition, Prop 20 needs to be passed in each house of the state legislature by a roll call vote with 3/4 or 75% of membership concurring. Are there any questions?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Great, next slide, please. Replace Proposition 25, replace cash bail bonds with risk assessment. The way it is now, people arrested for any crime remain in jail unless they post bail. Bail cash is often provided via a short-term and expensive loan from bail bond companies and backed by insurance companies. 2 years ago, in 2018, SB 10 law was passed to replace the cash bail system with a new system. However, it has not gone into effect because it was challenged by the American Bail Coalition. This prop would get rid of the bail system and allow the new state's law, SB 10, to go into effect. It would allow state or county judges and county sheriffs 36 hours to decide if people charged with serious or misdemeanor crimes should be released before pretrial proceedings, allowed a conditional release, or jailed based on the likelihood of being repeat offenders, public safety risk, or a flight risk. The fiscal impacts could be pretrial fees that could add hundreds of millions annually to the state general fund. Prop 25 could decrease county jail costs, possibly in high tens of millions annually. Next slide, please. Supporters say some people who are not yet found guilty or not even charged may be stuck with large debts to pay off the bail bond and low fees. That's if they were even able to get a loan by owning property to use as collateral. The current bail system is unfair. If you cannot afford bail, you must stay in jail. It keeps poor, low-risk defendants in jail and causes more imbalance in society at large. Justice reform and labor organizations contributed $8.3 million. Opponents say releasing people from jail will make our communities less safe. A computer-based system of algorithms to make important criminal justice decisions creates more biased outcomes for people of color and those from economically disadvantaged areas. $9.1 million in contributions from the bail bond companies. A yes vote means that you approve of the change this proposition would make, which is to stop the use of bail bonds. A no vote means that you want to leave things as they are now. This is a referendum, majority approval required. Are there any questions?
Yes. Just a minute.
Okay.
Is it known if removing bail is associated with any positive outcomes, such as less crime?
No, I don't have any information on that. They're saying that essentially, well, we can cover that in another, there's another slide coming up that can also talk about that for parolee. But as far as whether or not this would actually cut down on crime, that's not necessarily something I can answer.
Okay.
Okay,
Next slide, please.
we're talking about regulations. All right, so Proposition 21 has to do with local rent control. This would expand the ability of local governments to enact rent control measures. The way it is now, that housing is expensive in California, and several cities have rent control now, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose. The court limits rent control by the Costa-Hawkins Act of 1994. And it limits rent control by three ways. It's only on housing built before 1995. It exempts all single-family housing, and there's no restriction on a rent increase after vacancy. So the landowner could raise the rent to market value at that time. In 2019, a Tenant Protection Act was enacted, which stabilizes rents by allowing only a 5% plus inflation rent increase per year. And this would expire in 2030. As I said, this just came into effect, and it's only been on for a year. Okay, so Proposition 21 allows local governments three things. It enacts rent control measures on all residential properties, including single-family houses, which are over 15 years old. Instead of 25 years old, it'll be 15 years old. It exempts landlords with 2 or fewer properties from rent control, and it allows landlords to raise rents by 15% over 3 years after a vacancy. It also has the specification of a landlord's right to a fair financial return. Okay, the fiscal impacts are difficult to determine because it is dependent on what local ordinances enacted. All this does is it gives the cities and counties the right to enact rent control. It is expected it could just decrease state and local revenue because of lower income taxes. So next slide. Supporters say that even a small rent increase can push a family into homelessness. Rent control helps to keep families in their homes and provide stability for seniors and veterans. And this proposition which guarantees the right of the landlord to a fair rate of return. Opponents say that rent control hinders new housing construction and discourages construction of rental units. It would also encourage landlords to sell their properties because they feel that it's worth less money and they wouldn't be able to make their same amount of money as they were. And rent control results in less available and affordable units for rent. And rent control was resoundingly defeated in 2018 when we tried to repeal the Costa-Hawkins law. This would just amend that law. So it got here on a petition funded by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. The supporters have raised 24 million in contributions. Opponents have raised 44 million in contributions. And a yes vote means state law would allow cities and counties to apply more kinds of rent control to more properties than under current law. A no vote means the state law would maintain current limits on rent control laws that cities and counties can apply. And this is a simple majority is also. Are there any questions?
No, I think we are good at this time. So we can move on.
Move on to
Heidi?
I'd like to go back to Proposition 25 for a second and give you an answer that is more complete. In regard to Prop 25, if it passes, the proposition would ratify the SB 10, which was voted on 2 years ago, to allow state or county judges and county sheriffs 36 hours to decide if people charged with serious or misdemeanor crimes should be released before pretrial proceedings. There are many meetings that need to happen before a person can actually go to a trial court. So during the time of them waiting around, if they can't post bail, they just sit in the jails. And the point is that this SB 10 would give the authority to a judge or a sheriff to actually make the decision based upon if the person is a repeat offender, or if they have likelihood of knowledge that they would actually not show up for any of the proceedings for pretrial. So everything would be, looked at about the actual person who has committed a crime. And the public, they could determine at that time if that person is definitely going to be a safety risk. So I would assume, based upon that, this would also make sure that people are not released who should not be released, even if they could post bail bond, if that was still something that could be done. If this passes, you see what I mean? It's like, essentially, this is sort of a win-win, that the judges would have the authority to determine instead of somebody having enough money to get out. I hope that answers your question. Thank you. So moving on to Prop 22, app-based driver's classification, the way it is now. The state passed AB 5 in 2019 to update the state law to change who can be classified as an independent contractor versus employee. The 2019 state law requires rideshare and delivery companies to hire drivers as employees. The state attorney general and 3 cities are suing Uber and Lyft for refusing to follow the state's new law. An independent contractor can choose when, where, and how much to work. An employee has their schedule and work set by their employer. In the past few years, some exemptions have been added to exclude some professions. What will this proposition do? The prop would require rideshare and delivery companies to pay drivers at least 120% more than the minimum wage of $7.25 for a minimum wage of $15.95 for each hour spent driving, but not time spent waiting. It would also require companies with independent contractors drivers to provide their drivers with a health insurance stipend for 15 plus hours a week. Pay medical costs or replace some lost income when a driver is injured while driving or waiting. Institute a rest policy to prohibit drivers from working more than 12 hours in a 24-hour period. for a single rideshare or delivery. So no rides from San Francisco to Portland anymore. Other requirements would be to prohibit workplace discrimination, require a sexual harassment policy, conduct criminal background checks, and mandate safety training for drivers. This prop would also limit the ability of cities and counties to place additional rules on rideshare and delivery companies in the future. Fiscal impacts: there could be a minor increase in state income taxes paid by rideshare and delivery company drivers and the company investors from higher earnings on profits. Next slide, please. Supporters say forcing companies to hire drivers as employees would get rid of hundreds of thousands of jobs. The AB 5 law could lead to longer wait times, higher prices, and less access to rideshare work. At this time, we know of $185.1 million has been contributed primarily from the AP-based delivery services. Opponents say Prop 22 would eliminate basic workplace protections and replace them with lower guaranteed earnings and healthcare subsidies to save costs for the company. A majority of app-based drivers work 30 or more hours per week. Rideshare and delivery companies don't want to pay drivers basic benefits. $12.2 million have been raised primarily by labor organizations. A yes vote would allow app-based drivers to be categorized as independent contractors. A no vote would make app-based drivers a company's employee with benefits. This is an initiative statute, majority approval required by voters, and in addition, Prop 22 needs to be passed in each house of the California State Legislature by a roll call vote with 7/8 of the membership concurring. Are there any questions?
Yes, I have two questions. One is, can a person make their own determination as to which status they want, whether they want to be an independent contractor or an employee?
For an app-based driver, or if this passes?
Right.
No,
Yeah, if it passed.
No, they would become an independent driver, an independent contractor. That's how Uber and Lyft and all the other app-based drivers, they don't have employees unless you're at a particular administrative level, but not for drivers.
Okay. I'm sorry. Oh, yes. And the other question is, why must this be passed by the legislature? Does that mean that if to amend it, the legislature would have to do that? Or does the legislature actually have to endorse the amendment?
They have to endorse it to become an actual California state law.
So this doesn't refer to just if they wanted to amend it?
No, it wouldn't just, it would mean essentially if it passes, if this is a yes vote and it passes by the voters of California state, then it has to go to the state legislature, and each house has to determine if it actually can pass as the way the entire proposition is worded. Then that has to definitely go through with a 7/8 majority vote by the two houses to become law.
Okay, that's it.
All right, let's move on to Proposition 23.
Okay, Proposition 23, kidney dialysis clinics requirements. The way it is now with federal regulation as a basis of Medicare Medi-Cal certification, the Department of Public Health regulates chronic dialysis clinics. Private insurance companies pay more money for treatment than Medicare and Medi-Cal. There are two private for-profit companies who dominate 70% of the kidney dialysis clinics in California. They are DaVita and Fresenius Medical Care. A patient's personal doctor is only required to visit them once per month during treatment at a dialysis clinic. The U.S. has the highest mortality rate compared to Germany or Japan. 3 times a week, a high-risk patient must visit a dialysis clinic to stay alive. Some clinics do not have nurses or technicians who actually know how to help patients with one of 3 types of vascular accesses that are prone to infection or other possible major issues. Unfortunately, most Americans, 65%, have the dialysis catheters and have a high rate of clinic incidences, with accounts for the mortality differences across countries. In March 2020, 15 respected doctors from different medical institutions urged refinement of existing quality metrics and development of new measures that better reflect kidney care delivery. What will this proposition do? Prop 23 would require at least one licensed physician on site when treatments happen for about 80,000 Californians who receive dialysis from about 600 licensed clinics. A clinic could request an exception for a physician with a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant if there is a valid shortage in the area. The exception approved by the California Department of Public Health would last for 1 year. The required doctor, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site would be paid for by the chronic dialysis clinic. Fiscal impacts. Healthcare costs for state and local governments would likely increase in the low tens of millions of dollars annually. Next slide, please. Supporters say strong protections should be provided to vulnerable patients when clinics close. There should be proper reporting and transparency of infection rates to encourage clinics to improve quality, because the Department of Public Health receives complaints about health and safety conditions at dialysis clinics, while 2 for-profit companies make $3 billion a year. The number of patients is growing at 5% a year, which will increase the profits of dialysis clinics companies. How did it get here? Petition was funded by the Service Employees International Union, United Health Workers of the West. Opponents say Prop 23 may cause some dialysis clinics in the state to increase costs. Emergency room doctors strongly oppose, sorry, I just had a message come in, sending tens of thousands of patients to emergency rooms. 93.1 million in contributions, most likely from the 2 major dialysis companies. A yes vote, chronic dialysis clinics would be required to have a doctor on site during all patient treatment hours. A no vote, chronic dialysis clinics would not be required to have a doctor on site during all patient treatment hours. Initiative statute, majority approval required by voters. And in addition, Prop 23 needs to be passed in each house of the state's legislature by a roll call vote with 50% of the membership concurring. Are there any questions?
There are no questions on this measure.
So I must tell you that I've had our research team in the background has an update to, let's see here, can we verify the legislature needed to endorse Prop 22? And it says that I was incorrect, that the legislature does not need to endorse it. If voters pass this, a legislature wants to amend it, it would require 7/8 vote of both houses of legislature. Oh, my mistake. I misunderstood this entire thing. Then it says, let me see, should I read this? Let me please first scan it.
No, I think that's just the actual wording that she found.
Okay,
So
let me just say this though. If Prop 22 passes, state lawmakers can only come back and change it if the change is consistent with what Prop 22's backers would want 7/8 of the lawmakers to agree on. If you definitely want more information about this, I would go on to the scc.gov and look up the legal, or you could actually just Google state legislature, and there is a whole slew of information. So I'm sorry if I've confused anyone, but as you can see, I've given you the latest information. Next slide, please.
okay, moving on to number 24. Yeah, thank you.
So Proposition 24 is a very wordy, long proposition. And deals with consumer privacy laws or digital privacy. The way it is now, as you know, when you use the internet, companies collect your information, your age, your gender, your geolocation. But in 2018, the California Consumer Privacy Act, or the CCPA, was enacted, and it went into effect in January of 2020. This regulates the collection of personal data by requiring companies to notify consumers of their data collection. They must comply with certain personal privacy rights. You get free reports of data that's been collected. You can ask for the deletion of data, and you can tell businesses that you do not wish to have your data sold. Also, that companies cannot treat consumers who make use of the data differently than those people that allow their data to be sold. So Proposition 24 seeks to amend the CCPA in 4 ways. 1, it changes which businesses must comply with the requirements. It adds new protections, including limits on companies sharing your data, the right to collect data, the right to opt out, and other changes. It establishes stricter penalties and a shorter time to comply with those. And it also establishes a new state enforcement agency. This would also delays the implementation of the privacy law by 3 years, and so it would start in 2023. The fiscal impacts are a $10 million increase to fund the new agency. There would also be increased costs for the courts and the Department of Justice, as their workload would increase, mostly paid by penalties. There's an unknown cost to businesses to comply with this. Okay, so supporters say this would limit businesses' ability to collect, share, sell, and use consumer personal data, especially sensitive data like your health, race, geolocation, and your finances. The new agency would aid in the enforcement of these protections, and it makes it more difficult to weaken the privacy protections because it would require a ballot initiative to change this. This proposition was put on the ballot by Alistair McTaggart, and he was the one that also set up the 2018 ballot measure. The opponents say that this would miss the opportunity to implement an opt-in system like the EU has, although I've read that the Supreme Court has signified that they would not allow that to stay. I may be wrong about that, but I did read that somewhere. And then it creating a new agency adds to the bureaucracy in Sacramento, and it just delays the start of privacy protections until 2023. The adding of regulations adds an unfair burden to small businesses, and we should allow the CCPA time to work. Supporters have raised $5.4 million in contributions, and the opponents have raised just $20,000 in contributions. This is a yes vote means existing consumer privacy data privacy laws and rights would be expanded. Businesses required to meet the privacy requirements would change. A new state agency and the State Department of Justice would share responsibility for overseeing and enforcing the privacy laws. A no vote means businesses would continue to be required to follow existing consumer data privacy laws. Consumers would continue to have existing data privacy rights, and the State Department of Justice would continue to oversee and enforce these laws. Are there any questions?
Yes, we have one question. If I don't experience any problems with privacy issues, how would this affect me?
Well, you would have the right to more privacy. I mean, the protections are greater for people. Especially around sharing data and companies that buy and sell data. They especially deal with the personal privacy, like your medical information, all those things that are available online that would be would change. So if you haven't enacted, if you don't follow through with these, then it wouldn't. I don't think it would affect you. But although you do have the right to change things, I hope that's clear.
I would also add the observation that even though you may not have had an issue with any feeling that your privacy is invaded, you probably don't know what information is being collected about you and who has access to it. So these laws, I can't speak to the specifics of the laws, but I think that is the issue that they're trying to address.
Yes.
Okay, we'll move on now to our local issues.
Local measures. Okay.
This slide shows Measure O, the Palo Unified School District parcel tax. The way it is now, for 19 years, Palo Alto schools have benefited from locally controlled funding that cannot be taken away by the state of other school districts. The approximate $16 million in annual funding is used to keep great teachers in classrooms, preserve outstanding academic instruction, and support all students' education. What will this proposition do? It will increase the current parcel tax by $16 per parcel from $8.20 to $8.36 a parcel, which is planned to begin July 1st, 2021. In addition, the parcel tax would increase 2%, which is based upon inflation adjustment, also for 6 years. The district by law would need to institute additional accountable measures. Although specific projects are not identified, Measure O will protect academic excellence, add support staff to help at-risk students, maintain smaller class sizes, provide enhanced high school electives, and maintain teaching specialists. Parcel owners currently exempted from the district's expiring parcel tax would automatically be exempted from Measure O's parcel tax without having to file a new application. Fiscal impacts. The measure will allow the district to continue receiving approximately $16 million to maintain the expected high educational standards funded for all students. Next slide, please. Supporters say Palo Alto schools rely on local parcel tax funds to support high educational standards. The tax may not be used for administrative salaries or benefits. Supporting quality schools is a wise investment that protects our quality of life and values. Opponents say this is the time that the school board take a fresh look at their budget and come up with a new plan. California has record unemployment. Many are struggling to pay rent or mortgages. A yes vote means that you approve of extending the funding for 6 years. A no vote means that you do not want to fund the district's education. 2/3 vote is needed to pass. Are there any questions?
No, there are no questions at this time.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to Measure S, the Valley Water Parcel Tax. This would amend the current parcel tax. So the way it is now, a parcel tax was enacted in 2012, and it assesses approximately $68 per household, or $260 per acre. It supports a large list of water-related needs, including flood protection, dam maintenance, removal of toxins from drinking water, and other means to ensure access to clean water and prevent devastating floods. This measure will expire in 2028. It also provides for the formation of an oversight committee to audit the implementation and results of the program every 5 years. So this proposition is pretty simple. It would just permanently extend the parcel tax. It identifies several priorities, but it is really expected to be the same as the 2012 tax. The fiscal impact does not change as the tax rate doesn't change. It provides $45 million in funding yearly for the water department. This isn't all the money they get. This is just specifically for clean water and flood protection. Okay, so next slide. Supporters say that the measure would provide more stable funding to allow for future planning and projects. It would not increase the tax, only make it permanent funding source. The population in the South Bay is growing, and with the changes brought by climate change, the need for stability and funding is crucial. This was placed by the Valley Water Board. The opponents say, what is the rush? There are still 8 years before this tax expires. The Oversight Committee members are appointed by the Water Board, the group that they are supposed to audit, and so the feeling is that they are not really diligent in their oversight. The permanent tax does not allow for meaningful accountability of the Water Board, and any change to this parcel tax would have to be a ballot initiative. This requires a 2/3 majority to pass. And are there any questions?
Yes, we have the question, how does this affect Palo Alto, which has its own utilities?
we are, because we're part of Santa Clara County, this is for all of Santa Clara County, so we are currently being charged this approximate $68 per parcel. It's 6/10 of a cent. Is that right? Anyway, it's about $260 for an acre of land. But we're currently being charged this on our property taxes.
And I do believe we get some flood management benefits from the water district.
Yes, we do.
We also have a question. Why are they asking us to do this so far ahead of time?
That's kind of the question that most of the opponents have to say. There's 8 years left to go. I think that what they want to do is they believe that it's because it expires in 8 years, and that's when it would have to be renewed, that there's the funding becomes not stable. So this would stabilize the funding. They wouldn't have to come to the voters, you know, and hope that they're going to get that funding restored. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Moving on to our final measure.
Measure RR, Caltrain sales tax. The way it is now, Caltrain is an independent agency for the 3 Peninsula Counties transit agencies, who are VTA, Samtrans, and the SFMTA, also called MUNI. Caltrain is called the Peninsula Corridor Joint Powers Board. They operate passenger rail service between San Francisco and Gilroy. They serve 32 stations along the 77-mile corridor, operating approximately 90 weekday trains. This proposition will impose a use tax at the rate of 1/8 of 1% within the 3 counties. It will provide reliable funding to cover Caltrain's operating services, rail and train maintenance, and capital purposes. An independent citizens oversight committee would be established to verify compliance with the purpose of the tax and an annual public audit. It would expand Caltrain's peak hour service from 6 trains per hour per direction to 8 trains, as well as expansion of the Gilroy service to a minimum of 5 morning and 5 afternoon trains. The fiscal impact, the sales tax would generate approximately $100 million per year. Next slide, please. Supporters say Measure RR is needed to maintain the Bay Area's essential transportation network. Transportation studies indicate that Measures RR improvements would put the equivalent of 2 lanes of traffic on Caltrain instead of our highways. It will fund Caltrain's modernization program called CalMod with new electric trains and new electric rails that will be cleaner and quieter, also reducing noise and air pollution. Preserve service for thousands of essential workers, nurses, first responders, teachers, and students. How did it get here? Placed by the Caltrain Board, 3 County Board of Supervisors, and 3 transit agencies. Opponents say during COVID, Caltrain has lost approximately 95% of its ridership. The San Francisco to Silicon Valley service was used primarily by high earners before COVID compared to other directions. More thought about other options is needed instead of imposing a sales tax at this time. The yes vote is a vote to approve a sales tax of 1/8 of 1% within 3 counties for 30 years. A no vote is to not approve the sales tax. A 2/3 approval is required to pass Measure RR. Are there any questions?
There are no more questions at this time.
Great, thank you.
So we want to thank you on behalf of myself and Heidi and Judy for taking the time to join us and learn about the measures you'll be voting on soon. If you have questions after today, be sure to check the websites that we have another slide here.
Oh, sorry,
Yes.
yes.
That are shown on the slide for the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto and for Voters Edge, which is the state league's website for voter information about the election. A reminder that the deadline to register is October 19th, that you can find online registration and other information from the Santa Clara County Registrar of Voters or the SOS, which is the Secretary of State, the state government's website. So be sure to vote on or before November 3rd, and thank you again for joining us.